All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. Please use the chat feature to ask your questions as we move through the presentation. And we hope to have a few minutes to respond to all of your questions at the end, but fear not, if we run out of time, we do promise that we'll get back to you offline with any of the questions that we aren't able to get to at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. I'm Eva Velasquez, CEO of the Identity Theft Resource Center, and I'm joined today by our COO, James Lee. Together, James and I are going to share the findings from our first ever business aftermath study. This is our report that offers a first of a kind look at the impacts of identity crimes and cyber attacks on small businesses, including solopreneurs and gig workers. And this is meant to be a high-level overview, so we're going to move very quickly here. For those of you who are not familiar with our reports, you may see some similarities here. First and foremost, just as with our consumer aftermath report, our data breach report, and most of our reports, behind every statistic that we discuss today, there are people. And there are people who are trying to support their families and the families of their employees. As we began to look at the research and the data on this issue, we realized that most of the information available involved large organizations, but there really was no equivalent comprehensive study on how small businesses are impacted or how they recover from cyber events. Next slide, please. Before we look at the findings, just a quick word on how we gathered that information and from whom. We conducted a survey that was completed by 417 individuals that met the criteria of being a person in leadership or an IT professional at a small business as defined by the Small Business Administration. So that's a company of 500 or fewer employees. But even within the small business sector, we have to acknowledge there's going to be a huge difference in experiences with an organization of 499 employees versus an organization with 1 or 2. So 37% of our responses were from businesses with less than 10 employees and 6% were sole entrepreneurs. And as anticipated, respondents came from a variety of sectors, including government and nonprofits, proving something that we've said before, which is this is not an issue for any one or any single sector. This is impacting us very broadly. Next slide, please. Respondents were in leadership positions of their organizations. So these are the folks, they're the practitioners. They're the owners, senior leaders, and the technology folks. So they were in a position to really inform us about the real impacts that their organization was experiencing. Let's dig into the data.
And this is where I start. So let's look first at what kind of information was compromised in these kinds of breaches. So we're talking about both security breaches as well as a data breach. So a security breach is a traditional cyber attack. It may or may not lead to any kind of a data breach, but when they do, what kind of data was removed? And you can see here, employee data wins out slightly, but also there's a significant amount of intellectual property that is also being impacted by the kinds of attacks that we're seeing in this report. Let's look at the scope of the breaches. So we're looking at more than half, 58% of the respondents said that they had either had a data breach, a security breach, or both. So that both category is incredibly significant as well as the other two. But when you put that all together, that's 58% of organizations who are small businesses say they've been breached. How frequently are they breached? Well, here you see that these are people who say they have been breached within the last year, the last 12 months, in the last 1 to 2 years, which is the largest chunk of businesses who said they had been breached, and then fewer as you go back a few years. That's consistent with what we have seen in other trends, that being small businesses have only become a primary target of cyber attacks and data breaches within the last 2 years. So there's one more in there. Oh, nope, Eva, it's your turn.
Well, let's look at the cost and the financial impacts here. When we we're looking at this very broadly. So it includes things like lost revenue, lost customers, even fines and penalties. And those are going to be more in alignment with the size of the business, generally speaking. But some of these other costs, the marketing and the improved security, for example, when we're looking at small businesses, that can consume a disproportionate percentage of their company revenue. And when you see the majority of them, we're looking at 250K to 500K in financial impacts to their business. That's a huge amount of revenue for a small company. So we can actually, when we look at this data, we can posit that the financial impact is even more severe on a smaller business than it would be on a large enterprise, even though we're talking about smaller dollar amounts in most cases. It's a larger percentage of their annual revenue. And while few companies reported to us that this was a business ending event, their time to recover is very long, with some of them not even achieving that recovery at the time that they were responding to us. And we are going to dig into that a little bit deeper in just a moment. Next slide, please. And the ways that companies recovered. So you can see taking out new loans or lines of credit, dipping into cash reserves. So it was varied. But this was the finding for me, and James and I had to arm wrestle on who got to talk about this issue, but this was the one that really, for me, it drew the most parallels to our consumer aftermath report findings. And when I look at 40% of organizations either reducing staff or reducing their expenses, when you consider the downstream effects here, I mean, the reduction in staff, that's pretty obvious. We have a visceral understanding of what that impact would feel like. But think about that reduction in expenses. Were some of those things like vendor expenses or contractors? And then in turn, due to that loss in their revenue, did those organizations, those folks then have to turn around and reduce expenses or reduce staff? And the chain goes on and on. So just as victimization of an individual doesn't just impact that person, but it's their entire, personal network, their family, their friends, their coworkers, their communities. The victimization of small businesses has that similar impact. So this affects all of us in one way or another. Next slide, James.
Okay, let's look at the root causes of these kinds of attacks. Remember, we're talking about both cyber attacks as well as data breaches. So what we're seeing is here on the slide, you can read that, but the majority of them fall into two chunks, and that is, it is some form of malicious act. In some cases, we're seeing the effect of the pandemic with the increase in remote workers. 25% of these events were tied directly to a remote worker. And then you're seeing the same trends that you'd ordinarily see in our bigger reports around data breaches. That, in fact, it's very consistent with what we just reported in Q3, where we've said there have been more data breaches so far this year than there have been in all of the last previous years. But look here where we're talking about a failure to secure a cloud environment. That's very consistent with what we see in our regular data breach reporting. A third-party vendor, that's a supply chain attack. That's a very consistent kind of action, that the small businesses are often the entry point for these supply chain attacks that ultimately become attacks against much larger organizations and multiple organizations in that attack. You're also looking at here, you see more here of the failure to patch. You don't see as much of the failure to patch being a leading cause of a cyber attack or a data breach as it was several years ago. Large organizations have gotten much better and much faster about patching software. There are still attacks that are accomplished that way, but it's not like it was a few years ago when Gartner said it was 99% of all successful cyber attacks. You see phishing, that is very prominent in larger organizations, system errors, ransomware attacks, all the way down to human error. So we're seeing similarities with larger organizations, but at a bigger scale in many cases. There's a very interesting statistic here, and this is what Eva was alluding to, and that's the recovery time. How long did it take someone in their business, whether they're a solopreneur or they're a small business with a handful of employees, how long did it take them to actually get back to that pre-breach performance? Fortunately, there's a significant group here that it only took them a year. But let's look here at these others, though, where it takes more than 40%, it takes them between 1 and 2 years, up to 2 years. Then you've got still nearly 30% that is 3 to 5 years, and there are 7% of folks who said they have not yet recovered. So it is a long-term, highly impactful event, whether it's a data breach or a security breach or both. These are events which retard growth in small businesses, which is the economic engine of the US economy. What do people do when they do respond to the breaches? What you're seeing here is largely it falls again into a couple of chunks. One is there's a lot of new tools. Most organizations have discovered that they were deficient in the kind of tools they needed to protect themselves. And the other is training, both for the security team, but also for everyone else in an organization. Some people staffed up, some people increased their budgets to make room for all of these additional tools and additional training. And then some also are investing now, we're seeing, in increased vendor due diligence because, again, supply chain attacks. It's a single entry point somewhere down the food chain where the cyber criminals are trying to work their way up into the much larger organization or a much larger network where they can get attack multiple organizations and get the data from those groups.
Well, we still have some gaps to address here when it comes to victim notification. And we need to take a serious look at that 20% that we're not required to notify victims under their state law. I think there's a bit of a misconception. We talk about, well, we have all of these state laws that require notification, but they don't cover everything. Some are not as comprehensive or robust as others. And I think that's where this deficiency is coming from. And I think it's important. We do have to acknowledge that businesses are victims. But the individuals whose data is compromised, well, they're victims as well. And we need full transparency when people are affected so that they can be informed and can take that necessary action. We're very appreciative, and we were pleased to see that the vast majority of that 20%, those entities that were not required to notify, they did so anyway. But because of the scope of compromises and where we're at right now with breaches and cyber attacks currently, that is still leaving us with potentially millions of folks who were and are still unaware that there was some kind of compromise that occurred that had impacted their information. And thus they can't take any steps, or at least they can't be encouraged to take those steps to minimize the risks of future harms. Next slide, please. And almost all organizations offer some type of additional assistance to the affected individuals, be it a paid service, referrals to free services like us, like the ITRC. And we are pleased to see that companies are making those efforts. But we know that all breaches are not the same, and meaningful assistance is going to look very different based on the data that was either compromised or so that there's still a lot of confusion on the part of these companies as to what appropriate and meaningful assistance looks like based on that particular breach or compromise. And I think the message here is organizations like the ITRC, other advocates, and just other folks in this space, we need to help to continue to define what that looks like for impacted companies. So in the end, they can then provide meaningful assistance, meaningful resources to those affected individuals. Next slide, please.
Well, that was a little bit, it ended a little early. Let's go back to where we were. The miracles of modern technology. I think we're all used to these by now, right? after.
Well, the good news is we're actually getting to there we go, to the
There we go.
conclusions. And this is these are the key takeaways. So I'll focus on the first two and a little bit on the third one. I mean, the line between consumers and business victims is blurry. And, I talked about that when I'm talking about all of those downstream impacts and how it has this impact further down the chain, and more people than just the individual company are suffering the consequences. And the re-victimization rates. This was another piece that, gosh, it just so mirrors what we're seeing with our consumer reports. The re-victimization rate for individuals from our consumer aftermath report was 29%. And then we look at, for the 3/4 of small businesses that experienced a breach or an attack, it was multiple. Really, this is not sustainable. This is unacceptably high. And as James said, we are on pace to have the highest number of breaches this year since we've been reporting on them. We've already surpassed last year. So I don't know of any other crime, and if anyone knows, please feel free to tell me, but I don't know of any other crime that has this high of a re-victimization rate. And we're just getting pummeled by the threat actors. And it's really time for us to start thinking about and discussing and putting the processes in place about not just what's happening now, but what are the next threat vectors? What's going to be occurring in a couple of years? Because we're in the middle of it right now. And of course, we need to address this, but we need to be looking at what's in store for us in the future. Otherwise, these re-victimization rates are going to continue to grow, and we need to bring them down dramatically. And James and I go back and forth with everybody benefits from good cybersecurity and more cybersecurity training, that we agree on. I really believe that the focus has to be on the individuals at companies, and that's a missed opportunity. We need to leverage not just the IT folks and the technology folks, but all of your employees can be champions for good cyber hygiene and better practices. When you provide employee training, you're not only protecting your business, but you are helping to protect your employees, because they have told us in surveys that we've done and just in our communication, because we talk to folks, your average everyday consumer all the time, they take those habits with them. They take what they learned on how to protect their employer and their business and the company that they work for, and they take it home and they apply it in their daily lives. So it's very meaningful. And I think we need to have that kind of approach to have a bigger impact on this issue that is clearly systemic.
Yeah, I want to build on that a little bit because I think what we have, even though we saw in the slides here, and when you see the report, because you'll all receive a copy of the report here shortly, there was a significant number of people who say there were problems created by remote workers. But the reality is most of those problems that we saw at large enterprises and at small enterprises were early in the pandemic process. They're not the kinds of problems that we're necessarily seeing today, because we did adapt to that well. So now what we have to do is make sure we keep those habits as we go back to offices, and as time goes on, just human nature is what it is, that people will kind of relax a little bit, and maybe they'll let that security update go a day or two longer than they should have, or maybe they'll use that personal device because it's easier than trying to log in through the VPN or whatever on their work device. We need to keep up the level of good habits we developed during the pandemic, the height of the pandemic period, and we need to keep those going forward, and we need to build on those. The bad guys don't stop innovating, and that's a little bit to what Eva's point was. We have to be looking down the road. The bad guys don't stop innovating. We can't either. They continue to develop new ways to get around what we're doing. We need to continue to bring in everybody in our organization and everybody in our families, and to understand their personal responsibility for helping to keep people safe. Because as we know now, It's just like what happens in Vegas doesn't actually stay in Vegas. What happens online doesn't actually stay online. Those events, that data, everything that we do online impacts us downstream in some way. And for that reason, you see this next bullet point, that what we really need today also to help reduce the number of victims, which is everybody's goal, right, is we need a stronger cybersecurity, privacy, and identity standard. It needs to be comprehensive. One of the issues we have in our country is we've treated these three issues as very distinct. And so we have an infrastructure that treats them as separate issues and separate problems with separate solutions. And that's not true anymore. It probably was never true, but it's certainly not true today. So we need a comprehensive cybersecurity, privacy, and identity standard that is enforceable. Now, Congress is debating that now. You know, the ITRC provided testimony to the US Senate recently. We've got some follow-up questions we're going to provide to them at the end of this week. But we are at a time when we're actually having meaningful discussions about what can be done to help small businesses and businesses of all sizes and individuals be more secure. And one of the things is everybody understands what has to be done to protect yourself and protect your businesses by having very clear standards. We don't have it today. We need it. Lastly, there's another part of this. Not only do we need good standards and that are enforceable, so we know what the playing rules are, and we've leveled the playing field for everyone on the good guy side. There's still going to be victims, and we don't have a robust system. We don't have a robust infrastructure for helping victims today. We spent most of my career, and I suspect a lot of Eva's as well, thinking that businesses were not victims. And early on, they really weren't. They weren't the target. It was individuals who were the targets. The bad guys wanted individuals' information. That's not true anymore. They want to use individuals' information to get to businesses, not the other way around. So we have to look at the infrastructure that provides support to individuals who are victims and to businesses who are victims, and particularly for small businesses, because they just don't have the resources to be able to defend themselves and then to be able to recover when an attack actually occurs. So that's another conversation we all have to have. And what are we going to do to make sure that people have the tools to prevent these kinds of attacks, but also how are they going to recover? And that's the business of the ITRC. We are here to help people. We are here to help businesses recover when one of these unthinkable acts occurs. And unfortunately, they occur with a frequency that's unacceptable to everyone. So now I'll turn it back over to Eva. Oh, we have one. Wait, we do have one more slide. Hold on.
We do. Here is, I feel like after listening to James deliver that information to you about the need for more resources for victims, my work here is complete. Because this is just the heart of the Identity Theft Resource Center and something that we've been talking about for a long time. And while we have to have an impact on the preventative side, we have to acknowledge that while people are still being victimized, they need help. And it cannot come in the form of just generic assistance. That does not work for everyone. These are unique problems, unique situations. The data that's compromised in a lot of these attacks, it's not all homogenous. We have to have direct one-on-one assistance while we have these victimization rates this high. So we do want to thank everyone that helped to put this together. Of course, the ITRC team. We also had our partners at DigWorks. And so we have a special thanks to Jonathan Sassy and Andrew Steele of DigWorks for their pro bono work on behalf of the ITRC and helping us to get some additional data points and to inform this survey and this study. And actually, we have a lot coming soon. James, why don't you talk about what else is coming next?
Yes, we do have both in November and December, we've got 2 more reports. They're not going to be as comprehensive as this, but it's very interesting data that Anders and Jonathan helped us uncover. And it covers what happens when someone receives a data breach notice? So what do they understand what has occurred and what actions do they take? And then also very interesting information about credit freezes. You know, what do people know about credit freezes? What do they know about freezing their children's credit, and why they do or don't actually act on their ability to put a credit freeze in place. It's going to be really interesting information. We're going to release that in 2 chunks in November and December, because as we all know, it's the holiday season and everybody's looking for something a little bit different. So we're going to give it to you. We're going to give you some fresh data going into the new year. And then in January, we will have our annual data breach report that will know the final count from 2021 of how many data breaches we had and what the other trends are that we're going to see that we think will carry into 2022.
And with that, we can move to questions. So Alex, I think I saw a couple pop up in the chat. Do we have any questions to get to?
Yes, we do. So our first question is, did any of the survey responses talk about downstream issues from stolen employee data, issues such as vendor email compromise or other fraud typologies that came back in an attack to the business?
The answer to that is no, but we also didn't ask that question. This is our initial report. I guarantee you now that next year's survey will include that. So because that is a great it's a great question about what were the downstream effects and did it come back at some point to the company. But no, we didn't actually we didn't uncover anything in this particular report about that.
Well, that underscores the need for us to get the feedback from all of you folks and from the folks that engage with us so that we can continue to answer those hard questions. So keep them coming.
All right, next question is, how can we help Congress understand the impact of their law changes on this topic and encourage them to allow for victim protection and support in a more proactive way by incorporating it into the law changes and appropriations?
Well, I can start on the where I think we can pull the information from, and James, you could talk a little bit more about get in the weeds about the actual tactics there. But I believe that the data that we have, particularly in the consumer aftermath report, is a key to building a better understanding and connecting the dots for the lawmakers and the decision makers, because I think there's a real disconnect when they look at identity and cyber crimes. They don't necessarily feel, oh, how is this impacting someone's life? Is it really creating huge problems for them? How's it impacting them and stopping them from moving forward in their lives? And the aftermath, the consumer aftermath report, spells that out in great detail and makes it very concrete to understand how it's affecting their constituents and the people that they're representing, and how their decisions are going to have a big impact. And then James, from a process standpoint, you might have a little more to say there.
Yeah. Well, I think, and it's a great question, and I appreciate you for asking it. As a nonprofit organization, we're limited in what we can do. We are primarily an educational, and in this particular case, we're here to provide Congress and state legislatures and regulators with information, with good information about what is happening and the impacts on individuals, whether it's about identity crimes or data breaches, whatever it may be. So for an individual, if you feel strongly that we need a better or different system than what we have today, then I would certainly encourage you to let your elected representatives know that. In the United States Senate, it is under the jurisdiction of the Senate Commerce Committee. So I would look at that committee as someplace where you could, send an email, or I think people still send letters occasionally, but make a contact with members of the Senate committee, particularly if you're from one of their states. And on the House side, there's a number of committees, but if you start with your own representatives and tell them you think that this is a topic that they should pay attention to, and if it's not on their radar screen, have them tell you who of their colleagues is working on these topics.
Great. All right, next question we have is, do you have a sense as to how timely the breach notifications tend to be? I know some state laws address this, but I wonder what actually happens.
That's another great question. In fact, that's one of the topics that we just discussed at the Senate hearing. The only requirements for data breaches to be notified, for people to notify data breaches today, are at the state level. There's no federal law at this point that requires breach notices. We've been talking about one since 2005, but we do not have one. How timely is a great question, and I don't have a great answer for you. This is a little bit of a, we don't know what we don't know, but I can give you a couple of statistics. One of which is, in the United States, since 2004, when California passed the first data breach notice law, and up through earlier this month, we had more than 13,000 publicly reported data breaches in the United States. Now let's contrast that with the European Union, where they passed a data breach notification law that went into effect in May of 2018. So since May of 2018, they've had more than 260,000 data breach notices. So 120,000 of those just between January 2019 to January 2020. So common sense tells you we're missing a lot in the United States, based on every state having its own definition and its own timeline. So one of the things we hope to come out of this discussion with the Senate that will move over to the House and Congress is that we will have some form of a uniform standard around data breach notices.
Great. Next question. It sounds like the statistic around remote work identifies gaps in employee training and security policies, personal devices, updates, etc., and not that remote work is associated with an increase in malicious insider attacks. Am I understanding this correctly?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, yeah, I don't think there's anything that shows that people are more susceptible to attack, in the sense that there are more attacks being directed at them, but yeah, the lack of training or a lack of security policies, lack of security tools, I think, is what you're seeing reflected in these numbers. Eva, do you have anything?
No, that I agree. With everything that you're saying, and we also have seen that a lot of this was, it has changed. It was the new to remote work when things were first starting, and a lot of that has been, not all of it by any stretch of the imagination, but a lot of that has now been addressed as it went on longer and longer.
Looks like we have a question from Debbie. She raised her hand, so I am going to allow to talk.
Thank you. I was actually writing up the question. I thought I lowered my hand, but I'll just ask. Based on the internet crime reports for the last few years, I know that business email compromise and its variations, including, the real estate kind of taking the initial down payment and all that, is the #1 reported crime to IC3 of all crimes as far as. Was that something that you guys saw in your insights on the small business report as well?
We didn't get down to the point of what particular crimes people were seeing, because in this initial report, we were just trying to set the baseline. So there again, I think going forward, we'll start to expand our question base, and that's a good one to find out, okay, what is actually occurring in that respect. But I will tell you that all of our other data that we see does tend to mirror what you see at IC3 and to a degree the Federal Trade Commission.
FTC.
Great.
And thanks, Debbie. She's a longtime champion for consumers and victims. So we appreciate the question and we appreciate you being here.
Yes, thank you, Debbie. We have another question. What can one do to avoid being penetrated into his or her personal or business information by the cyber criminals?
The list is long. I mean, I think that for individuals, we always talk about good cyber hygiene and starting small. I think that based on your interest in being here, you probably have some idea of what the basics are, but I feel like that's a great question for us to send you some of our tip sheets and resources offline and just send those over, because I know we all want the pat answer of do this one thing or do these top 3 things. And while we can certainly rank the steps in, in a hierarchy of what's most important, it isn't just a couple of things. There's a mindset and a culture that has to be built, mindset for individuals and a culture at organizations that has to be built. So we'll be happy to send over some of that information in writing and share that with you. James, do you have anything to add? Any details there to add? It's just such a long list.
If there's 2 things you should do right now if you haven't already done them.
Oh no, do I know what you're going to say? Are you going to say patch?
No,
Oh.
no, I'm not going to say patch. That would be 3. The first one is freeze your credit. The second one is make sure that you are practicing good password hygiene, where you don't have passwords that you reuse on multiple accounts, and heaven forbid that you use the same passwords and logins at work as you do at home. So if you do those 2 things, that gets you 75% of the way. You want to get closer to the end goal, patching, but also 2-factor authentication. If you're a business owner or an executive at a business, you need to ask your team, why don't you have 2-factor authentication as a service for your customers? And in particular, 2-factor authentication with an app, not with the SMS text, but use an authenticator app. If you do those 4 things, that is about as secure as you can get from a prevention standpoint.
Wonderful. Well, I think that just about wraps it up here, and we will be sending a copy of the report and the recording to all of our attendees. So thank you so much for being with us today, and we hope we can answer any other questions that you may have by sending it to our email, communications@idtheftcenter.org.
Thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thanks.